Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. What's going on with Biden's policy towards Israel edition? We had a pretty dramatic development just yesterday when the Biden administration sent a letter to Ron Dermer, the Israeli minister. It's a letter from Lloyd Austin and Anthony Blinken to them, demanding that Israel take steps within 30 days to improve the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza or risk the supply of U.S. weapons. So, even though the administration later denied that it had threatened to cut off military aid to Israel, that's not true. There's an implied, at least, threat to stop military aid to Israel unless it increases humanitarian aid to Gaza. And also, it's linked to several other conditions that we'll talk about. But on the other hand, while it's threatening Israel, it's also sending THAAD missiles to Israel to shoot down um, possible Iranian attacks. So there's a duality there that bothers a lot of people. And it's one of the reasons the Biden administration is exposed to a lot of criticism. Some saying they're too supportive of Israel, people saying they support genocide, etc., the people on the left, and people on the right saying it doesn't support Israel at all, it's pro-Iranian. It's open to a lot of criticism because the policy doesn't seem to be particularly coherent. And on a very basic level, it's not coherent. But what we're going to try to do in this episode is explain why the policy looks the way it does. So first, let's get back to the letter. So the letter says, quote, "The amount of assistance entering Gaza in September was the lowest of any month during the past year. To reverse the downward humanitarian trajectory as consistent with its assurances to us, Israel must, starting now and within 30 days, act on the following concrete measures," and then gives a list of measures, which we'll talk about. Then it says, "Failure to demonstrate a sustained commitment to implementing and maintaining these measures may have implications for U.S. policy under NSM 20 and relevant U.S. law, weapons supply." So, according to U.S. law, states that do not follow international law, the U.S. can and should stop supplying them with weapons. And that's often been something that members of Congress, especially Democrats, but also some Republicans, have said the administration should consider doing. Now, there's some controversy really over whether Israel has been sending him less supply. I've seen some Hogat numbers that dispute that fact, but the administration is claiming that in September, 50% less aid was arriving, and Kamala Harris claimed that for 2 weeks aid was not coming in as Israel was tightening a siege on areas in northern Gaza, especially on Jabalia. The background to this is really that the Biden administration is very concerned that something called the General's Plan or the Island Plan, not islands, by the way, Island, Eiland, named after the general who came up with the idea, is being enacted. And the Island Plan is the idea there is to create a siege on city after city in Gaza, um, taking the um, civilian population out and then laying a siege onto the terrorists that remain and starving them out, clearing them out, taking city by city. This seems to be something that the Biden administration has a lot of problems with. And Israel is claiming that it's not doing that. But on the ground, we're seeing some signs that it is. So it's all a little bit confusing. And knowing Israeli strategy, or lack thereof, we're probably seeing Israel start to do that. And now that there's pushback, maybe stop doing that. We've never seen Israel really commit to anything in Gaza in the long term. We'll see. So the U.S. demands a bunch of things. Um, the transfer of 350 trucks daily to the Gaza Strip through all four current border crossings, as well as the opening of a fifth crossing. They said that Israel should carry out humanitarian pauses throughout Gaza to allow distribution of aid for at least the next 4 months. It demand that Israel allow the Palestinians who are concentrated in the Mawasi, that's the supposed safe zone in Gaza, to move inland and away from the coastal areas before winter. They also demanded that Israel end the isolation of northern Gaza Strip and officially announce it has no policy of forced evacuation of Palestinians from northern Gaza Strip to the southern Strip. So basically, no island plan. And to allow the Red Cross to visit Palestinian detainees in detention centers. The letter also showed concern at a law that is on its way to passing in Israel, severing ties between Israel and UNRWA, the UN organization that Israel claims is implicated in terror attacks. Um, some of these are things that Israel can do more easily. Some it can do more easily. Honestly, if you ask me, they're all pretty reasonable. On a humanitarian level, what they're really concerned about now is that winter is coming, not to sound too Game of Thrones about it, and people living in tents near the ocean in the Mawasi are going to have a very difficult winter. United States would like to avoid that. And some of this is really, we're already after a year of the conflict, and these measures no longer seem temporary. It looks like a long-term project going on in Gaza. And that means if it's a long-term project, you have to figure out ways to alleviate day-to-day lives for Palestinians. And that's where humanitarian pauses come in. I think that's a very good and useful idea. But on a more macro level, we're seeing the US more forcefully enter into trying to limit um, Israeli excesses in Gaza in a way that it hasn't done until now. But meanwhile, it's supporting Israel very heavily on the Iranian front. The U.S. sent for the first time a battery of missiles to shoot down Iranian missiles at Israel, the THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missiles anti-missile system, along with the personnel to operate it. This will supplement the Israeli system, and I've been told by IDF sources that it's very helpful because the THAAD has advantages the Israeli systems do not, so they complement each other really nicely. On a strategic level, it's very important because we, for the first time, have U.S. forces protecting Israel on Israeli territory. As far as I know, it's the first time that's happened since the first Gulf War, when the U.S. sent Patriot missiles to Israel. So that actually tightens security relations between the U.S. and Israel, while the Biden administration is signaling distance on the diplomatic front regarding the humanitarian problems in Gaza. And that comes along with a lot of other measures the U.S. has done relating to Iran, deploying the Navy's most advanced naval carrier, for example, the USS Gerald Ford. According to analysis by Brown University, the U.S. since October 7th has given Israel $18 billion worth of military assistance, a massive amount. So why is there so much dissonance between what's happening on the Iranian front and what's happening on Gaza front? So the discourse that you hear from people is very misleading about why this is happening. Some of that is because people don't really understand American foreign policy, and some of that is because there's elections coming, and people want to either make the Biden administration seem pro-Israel or anti-Israel, depending on their electoral needs. But the truth is, the Biden administration is continuing a long tradition by American administrations of trying to balance different interests. Right now, the way the Biden administration sees the world is it's in the middle of a battle against the Kremlin, Iran, North Korea, and to an extent, China. They've been talking about forming an axis. Biden has always been very proactive in countering that axis, not believing in a raw power version only of countering that axis, but also countering it through diplomacy. So, how do you counter that kind of thing through diplomacy? The most important thing you want to do, this has always been one of the great challenges the United States had, is harmonizing the interests of your allies. So, the US, just in the Middle East, has a bunch of allies with very different interests. Think of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, they share some anti-Iranian interests, but they have so many differences regarding, say, Gaza, right? Where the Israeli public opinion towards Gaza is, shall we say, unfriendly. But in most Arab countries, they see the pictures coming out from Gaza and it causes unrest. It makes people say to the Arab governments, do something about it. And if the US wants to keep those countries on side, it needs to do something about it. And it's not just them. You also have the EU. The EU is an essential partner, absolutely essential in the struggle against the Kremlin. But a lot of countries in the EU have problems with the way Israel is conducting its warfare. So that means that in order to keep the coalition together, Israel needs to cut out its worst excesses on the humanitarian front. I'm not saying that the political elements aren't also important. Of course they are. There's voters who care about this stuff, but there's also international countries that care about this stuff. And if you want their cooperation, you need quid pro quo. But then why not be harder on Israel? Because Israel is absolutely essential in battling Iran. Israel is the linchpin, militarily speaking, of resistance to Iran. And therefore, the more the US supports Israel against Iran, the more it's able to curtail Iranian influence in the region on the cheap. What does it mean on the cheap? Not that it doesn't cost money, but without the US going to war, without losing American soldiers, and preferably, the US would hope, without raising the price of oil. So what the US is trying to do is what it's always tried to do. Use Israel as a proxy against its enemies. It did that against Soviet Union, now it does it against Iran, but also stop it from doing things that will hurt its alliances that it needs in order to counter those enemies. And that's a balancing act and it's a tough one. And it's always led to tensions, it's always led to discrepancies, and it's always led to a sense of incoherence. People say, if you don't want Israel to build settlements, why are you sending them arms? And if you want them to counter your enemies, why would you pressure them on settlements? You get those questions from both sides. But the truth is, you need to do both those things. You need Israel to be a good ally that can be part of a global regional alliance. And you need Israel to be strong enough to fight against America's enemies. So while the Biden policy is incoherent, it's also very coherent. And it's also very traditional. This has always been the American policy. And honestly, I'll tell you the truth. The reason it's always been the traditional American policy is because it's the only policy that makes sense. You can't not arm Israel because then Iran would run rampant. But you also can't let Israel do whatever it wants in the region and undermine any alliance the US has with Arab and Muslim partners. So you have to do both. You go in with intentions to be more pro Israel, more anti Israel. Think of someone like Obama or Carter, who came in to be more anti Israel. Think of someone who came in to be more pro-Israel, like Clinton or Lyndon Johnson. They also ended up pressuring Israel on the peace process. If they were more pro-Israel, they also ended up arming Israel if they were more anti-Israel, because that balance is required by American national interests. Okay, I have some questions. I haven't done this in a while, so I had some questions. Let me answer them. One is from Sunny Levine. He says, I've been a little confused by the footage coming out of Lebanon. Golanchiks, that's Golani soldiers, strolling around Hezbollah positions, showing off captured gear, still in their packaging, with no evidence of a fight. Are Hezbollah just abandoning these posts? Were they just forward positions that were never meant to be occupied for defensive operations? Neither really makes sense given how much effort has gone into fortifying these points and stocking them with arms. Also, most of this footage seems to still be just on the villages like Yarun, Marun al Ras, and Odaise. Do the IDF really have control of these towns? This is normal fog of war stuff, but by now we should have a rough idea of where the front line is. Okay, so first, I'm not going to talk about the front line. First of all, I don't 100% know where it is. Second, some of the information that I've seen is still considered classified by Israel. They are keeping that very vague intentionally. So I will leave that alone. But yes, Israel's mostly, not only, in the villages right across from the border. It hasn't made a decision on the political level to go beyond that on the ground. Yeah. So let's start with that. As for why are these positions abandoned? That's a fascinating question. We saw some interrogations from Hezbollah members in the last couple of days, and they confirmed that Hezbollah members have been escaping. The Hezbollah interrogation I saw, he called the people who escaped people of little faith, people who didn't believe enough in the cause. But I think it's something a little bit different than that. You have to remember that before Israel invaded, it did those two operations, the assassination of Nasrallah and the rest of the high command. But I think more importantly, the beeper operation. Beeper operation really neutralized, I think, and disrupted completely the middle levels of the ranks in Hezbollah. Everyone between the high command and the people down. And I think for a long time, a lot of people weren't getting orders. And when you're not getting orders from above and you're attacked, you withdraw because you're not sure if anyone's there to support you. You're not sure if any of the battle plans that you had are actually still realistic. It's not that different from what we saw in 1967 when Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force and the Egyptian command system collapsed. A lot of mid-level officers ran away to Egypt, leaving their soldiers behind. So of course their soldiers didn't fight well. Here, we really had people ended up in the hospital, dying, just scared to communicate with other people because that operation I think is really what did that. That's just a guess, but I think that otherwise we'd be seeing much more fierce battling from Hezbollah. In the first couple of days, I did hear of some pretty fierce hand-to-hand combat, and there were several soldiers dead, you might remember. But that seems to have abated. I think that Hezbollah is much less of a tough nut to crack right now because of those operations. Those operations were very successful. Um, Graham Phillips says, my question is, how is Sinwar still at large? Given how Israel has dealt with Hezbollah, it makes no sense they haven't caught up with Sinwar. So I think it's a pretty open secret by now that Sinwar is believed to be by Israeli intelligence with a bunch of hostages, maybe a core group of 10 to 20 hostages, might be fewer now, I don't know. And Israel doesn't believe it can get near him without them being killed. At this point, considering how well Israel has done with assassination, that seems to be the most likely explanation for him not being dead. Not so much that they can't catch him, but that catching him would come with a cost that Israel doesn't want to pay. Extus asks, I have a question about Iran. Israel can't target Iranian oil because of U.S. pressure and its nuclear facilities, which are deep under the mountains. What would be a good target in response to a missile attack on Israel? The missile factories? And does Israel expect a response after that from Iran, which could in turn provoke an escalation? Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about that in Israeli cabinet meetings, military meetings. Israel's also talked extensively with the United States about this issue, and there's been a lot of leaks about what has been decided. Maybe it's misinformation, maybe it isn't, in the Washington Post. What they said in the Washington Post is what I expected. They're not going to attack oil because that would raise the price of oil before the elections. That's not going to happen, or at least that's not going to happen with U.S. approval. Nuclear facilities doesn't look like Israel can destroy, like you said. So Israel is going to try to go for a very strong retaliation on military targets. Would that only be missiles? Not necessarily. It could also be IRGC. Israel wants to really teach Iran a lesson, and I think it might attack more broad military targets. Ideally, the U.S. would like the kind of attack that Iran can sort of shrug off and pretend didn't happen and not have a counter response. That's something the U.S. is trying to get Israel to do. That's the goal. Will it succeed? I don't know. I think Iran is pretty easy to convince not to attack again because if there's one thing we've seen recently from Iran is that all their attempts to punish Israel haven't been particularly successful. Their proxies actually do a much better job with drones and so on and so forth than they have. They've been trying to assassinate Israeli figures. All those attempts have failed. They tried to shoot hundreds of missiles and rockets at Israel. They haven't really done much damage. I'm not sure Iran has much more to escalate to. Unfortunately, there is an Achilles heel that Israel has, and that's the drones. Israel really drones, UAVs. Israel doesn't really have a good answer for them. That's why we've seen a bunch of very successful attacks recently. So Iran might start to channel more effort into that because Israel's not as good as doing that. But generally speaking, I think that Iran has found that it doesn't have anywhere really good to escalate to. And that's one of the reasons if you give them an excuse not to attack back, I think they won't. Okay, that's the end of this episode. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Israel Media. I'll be dropping a new episode of History of the Land of Israel podcast in the next day or two, so stay tuned for that. And I will see you here again next time something interesting happens.